Dad, you're 72. You're too old to keep pretending you can live here alone. Emily said it while standing in my bedroom with one hand resting on Margaret's old dresser, as if the room already belonged to her. I was still in the hallway, holding 2 mugs of coffee, when I noticed the tape measure stretched across the floor and a brochure for a memory care community half hidden beneath her purse. My daughter smiled too quickly. I'm just thinking ahead. I set the mugs down and asked why thinking ahead required photographs of my closet, my bathroom, and the inside of my desk. She told me I was overreacting. Then she gathered her papers, kissed my cheek, and left without taking the brochure. 10 minutes later, I found a sealed envelope wedged behind the bottom drawer of my nightstand. My full legal name was typed across the front. Inside were papers designed to remove me from my home before I even knew I was being judged unfit to live in it. The first page was a draft petition for emergency guardianship. The second was an intake agreement for a secured memory care unit 40 minutes away. The third was a market valuation of my house, complete with photographs taken from angles I had never approved. There was also a durable power of attorney bearing a signature that looked like mine until I noticed the tail of the Y. I had signed thousands of engineering plans during 41 years of work, and I knew the small habits of my own hand. That signature had been copied, not written. The petition claimed I left the stove on, forgot medication, became disoriented in familiar places, and once failed to recognize my granddaughter. None of those things had happened. I stood there in the quiet bedroom, hearing the refrigerator hum down the hall, and wondered whether my daughter was trying to save me from a decline I could not see, or whether she had been preparing to take my life apart while calling it care. My name is Walter Hayes. I spent most of my adult life designing bridges, drainage systems, and roadways across central Ohio. I trusted measurements because they did not flatter you, and I trusted concrete because it revealed every shortcut eventually. People were harder. 4 years earlier, my wife, Margaret, died after a short fight with pancreatic cancer, leaving me in the house we had bought when our daughter was 9. Since then, I had lived alone, cooked for myself, handled my bills, drove to church on Sundays, and met 2 retired colleagues for breakfast every Thursday. I was not pretending to be 35. My knees complained on stairs. I needed reading glasses, and sometimes I walked into a room and forgot why. But age was not the same as surrender. Before I tell you what those papers eventually cost my family, I need you to understand how easily concern can become control when nobody is willing to name the difference. It began 6 months before I opened that envelope. The accident itself was ordinary. I had been replacing a cracked weather strip along the bottom of the garage door when my left foot caught the edge of a folded drop cloth. I went down hard on one hip and knocked a metal shelf sideways. Nothing broke, but the bruising looked dramatic enough that my neighbor, Denise, called Emily after helping me inside. By the time my daughter arrived, I was sitting at the kitchen table with an ice pack and a cup of coffee. Emily stood over me with tears in her eyes and said, "What if Denise hadn't been home?" I told her I would have used my phone. She pointed out that the phone had been on the workbench. That was true. The next morning she scheduled a doctor's appointment, ordered a medical alert pendant, and installed grab bars in the downstairs bathroom. I complained, but I also felt cared for. After years of wondering whether I had failed her as a father, I was grateful to be needed in a way that did not involve writing a check. Emily was 43. Organized, quick, and more like her mother than she liked to admit. As a child, she had learned not to expect me at every recital or parent conference, because road projects rarely respected family calendars. I missed her 8th grade awards night after a retaining wall collapsed outside Newark. I missed the first half of her college graduation because a contractor had ignored a soil report. Whenever I came home late, I brought gifts and assumed they could stand in for presents. Margaret warned me they could not. Emily never accused me directly, but she remembered, even as an adult. She had a way of saying, "You always solve things with money." Whenever I offered help, that history mattered, because when she began taking over small parts of my life, I mistook surrender for trust. I gave her access to my online bill-paying account for emergencies. I let her store copies of my insurance cards. I told her where Margaret and I kept the trust documents. I believed openness would prove that I had finally learned how to be a father. Her husband, Mark Carter, encouraged every new arrangement. Mark owned a residential remodeling company called Carter Home Renewal and had the polished confidence of a man who could make a leaking roof sound like an opportunity. He replaced the loose garage shelf, added motion lights near the back steps, and refused payment. Family takes care of family, he said. A week later, while examining the gutters, he casually asked whether the mortgage had been paid off. I said it had. 11 years earlier. He whistled and looked up at the brickwork. Good for you. Places around here are going for crazy money. I thought nothing of it. Real estate was part of his business. And Mark talked about property values the way some men talked about baseball. What I did notice was how often he and Emily whispered in the driveway before coming inside. When I asked what they were discussing, Emily would smile and say, "Logistics." At the time, I thought she meant my appointments, the grab bars, or the new pill organizer she had insisted on placing beside the coffee maker. The changes arrived, disguised as conveniences. Emily moved my important mail into a labeled tray, then began opening envelopes before I saw them. She replaced my handwritten calendar with a shared digital one and acted surprised when I objected. She asked for the password to my investment account, saying she only wanted to know whom to call if I were hospitalized. I refused that one, and something in her face tightened before she covered it with a laugh. Fine. Dad, keep your secrets. 2 weeks later, she brought me a brochure for Meadow Glen, an upscale retirement community with a dining room, exercise classes, and small apartments overlooking a pond. I told her it looked pleasant for someone who wanted to move. She said, "You don't have to wait until you're desperate." I reminded her that I had climbed onto the roof the previous fall to clear leaves. "Exactly," she replied. "A 71-year-old man should not be on a roof." That was the first time her concern sounded less like love and more like a verdict. There were also small incidents that seemed harmless until I found them listed in the guardianship papers. One Tuesday, I missed a dental cleaning because Emily had moved it on the shared calendar without telling me. She later wrote that I had forgotten the appointment. Another afternoon, I could not find my truck keys for nearly an hour. Emily discovered them in the kitchen junk drawer and said gently, "See, this is what scares me." I had never kept keys there. On Thanksgiving, I called my granddaughter Lily by Emily's name, while both of them were standing behind me in the kitchen. Everyone laughed, including me. The petition transformed that moment into a claim that I had failed to recognize Lily. Reading those distortions in my bedroom, I understood that Emily had not merely been noticing my mistakes. She had been collecting them. Worse, she had been improving them, polishing ordinary lapses until they looked like symptoms. I read the pages twice, hoping I had misunderstood the legal language. I had not. I called her that evening, but did not mention the envelope. "Did you leave anything in my bedroom?" I asked. There was a pause long enough for me to hear a television in the background. "No. Why would I be in your bedroom?" she replied. I reminded her that she had measured the room that afternoon for furniture placement. "Dad, we talked about this." We had not. I asked whether she had contacted Meadow Glen. Her voice hardened. "You need options. I'm not apologizing for planning ahead." Then she changed direction and asked whether I had taken my blood pressure medication. It was a clever move, because any anger in my answer could be treated as proof that she was right. I said yes, wished her good night, and ended the call. For several minutes I sat at the kitchen table staring at the black screen of my phone. My first instinct was to drive to her house and demand an explanation. My second was to tear every page in half. I did neither. Bridges fail fastest when people react before understanding where the pressure is coming from. The next morning, I photographed each document and placed the originals in a locking metal box Margaret once used for jewelry appraisals. Then I drove to my bank. The branch manager, a woman named Carla Nguyen who had known me for years, showed me that Emily had view and pay access to my checking account but could not transfer ownership. I asked for the access to be removed. Carla studied me for a moment and said, "Is everything all right?" I told her I was updating security after some family confusion. She did not press, but she printed 90 days of transactions at my request. Near the end of the report was a payment for $4.800 to Carter Home Renewal. The memo read, "Home Safety Repairs." I had not authorized it. Mark had installed grab bars, 2 lights, and a replacement shelf, but he had repeatedly refused payment. Even generous pricing would not have reached a quarter of that amount. Someone had used my account to turn a favor into an invoice. I went home and checked every wall, receipt, and contractor email I could find. There was no signed estimate. No invoice had ever arrived in the mail. The payment had been initiated through the online access I gave Emily. I called her again, this time asking directly about the $4. "Baba." She sighed as though I were a child questioning a grocery receipt. "Mark's bookkeeper processed it wrong. We were going to fix it." I asked why the company had any authority to pull money from my account. "I paid it. Dad, you told me to handle the safety upgrades." I had told her to buy what was needed, not to pay her husband's company thousands of dollars without an invoice. She said, "This is exactly why I'm worried. We had this conversation." We had not. When I insisted on repayment by Friday, she became quiet, then said, "You're making everything harder than it needs to be." The sentence stayed with me because it was not the language of someone caught in an error. It was the language of someone whose plan had encountered resistance. That afternoon, I opened the fireproof cabinet in my study and pulled out the Hayes Family Revocable Trust. Signed 9 years earlier. Margaret and I had created it to simplify matters if one of us died or became incapacitated. The document named me as trustee after her death and Emily as successor trustee if I could no longer manage my affairs. I remembered the broad structure, but not the exact trigger. On page 27, the language was clear. Emily could assume control if 2 licensed physicians certified that I lacked sufficient capacity to manage financial and personal decisions. A successor trustee would then control the house, taxable investment account, and a separate education fund Margaret had established for Lily. I sat back in my chair, suddenly aware of how much power I had placed behind a door that required only 2 signatures to open. Emily knew about the trust. She had asked where it was kept. She had even borrowed the binder after Margaret died, claiming she needed a copy of the beneficiary pages. I returned to the hidden envelope and found a document I had overlooked because it was tucked inside the Meadow Glen intake packet. It was a letter addressed to Dr. Paul Kenner, a physician whose name I did not recognize. The unsigned draft asked him to review documented cognitive incidents and provide a preliminary opinion supporting emergency intervention. Attached was Emily's 12-page log. Some entries described real events distorted beyond recognition. Others were complete inventions. One claimed I had wandered outside at 2 in the morning and been returned home by a neighbor. I called Denise and asked whether she had ever found me outside at night. She laughed, then stopped when she heard my tone. "Walter." "No, never." Another entry claimed I had left a burner on for 3 hours. My stove was connected to a smart home application Emily had installed after my fall. I did not yet know how to retrieve the usage history, but I knew I had never smelled smoke or found a hot pan. Near midnight, I checked the envelope one last time before locking it away. A yellow sticky note was attached to the back of the draft petition, written in Emily's unmistakable block letters. "File after Dad moves funds or refuses placement. House can list immediately once temporary order is granted." Below that, in different handwriting, Mark had added, "Need appraisal updated. Equity should cover bridge loan." I read those 2 lines until the words lost shape. The papers were not preparation for some distant emergency. They were instructions tied to a financial deadline. My daughter was not only trying to place me in a facility. She and her husband expected the equity in my home to rescue something of theirs. I closed the metal box, slid it behind a row of old engineering manuals, and turned off the study light. By morning, I knew I would need a lawyer. What I did not yet know was how much of my life Emily had already put on paper or how soon she planned to take those papers to a judge. Samuel Green's office occupied the second floor of a restored brick building near downtown Columbus, above a bakery that smelled like cinnamon even in January. He had helped Margaret and me create our trust 9 years earlier, and he greeted me without surprise when I set the metal box on his conference table. Samuel was 68, narrow-shouldered, careful with his words, and almost impossible to rush. He read the guardianship petition first, then the Meadow Glen agreement, then the copied power of attorney. When he reached Mark's note about the bridge loan, he removed his glasses and asked, "Has anyone filed this with the court?" I said I did not know. Samuel searched the probate docket while I waited. No petition had been filed yet. I exhaled for the first time that morning. He did not. "That only means they haven't filed it yet," he said. "Walter, do not confront them again. Do not move large sums of money. And do not start giving assets away. Every impulsive action can be repackaged as evidence that you are unstable." Samuel explained guardianship in plain language. Emily could not simply declare me incompetent and take my home, but she could ask the probate court for emergency authority if she claimed I faced immediate danger. A judge might appoint an investigator, order medical evaluations, and temporarily restrict major financial decisions while the case was reviewed. "The facts are in your favor," he said, tapping the forged power of attorney, "but only if you behave like the competent man you say you are." I disliked the sentence, though I understood it. Being innocent did not guarantee looking innocent. Samuel photographed the original documents, placed copies in his file, and gave me a list of immediate steps: independent medical evaluation, written revocation of Emily's account access, preservation of smart home records, and a complete inventory of my assets. Before I left, he asked whether Emily might have access to my house keys. I told him she did. "Change the locks," he said, quietly, "and don't tell her what you found until we know how much she already knows." I scheduled an appointment with Dr. Lena Ortiz, a geriatric specialist unaffiliated with Emily or Meadow Glen. Her waiting room was filled with older patients accompanied by adult children, and for the first time, I understood how easily concern could become a courtroom exhibit. Dr. Ortiz asked about my fall, my medication, Margaret's death, my sleep, my driving, and the moments when I forgot names. She did not treat every mistake as a diagnosis. Grief, stress, and poor sleep can affect attention, she said. That is not the same as losing decision-making capacity. She performed a brief screening, then referred me for a full neuropsychological evaluation. I scored well enough that day, but not perfectly. I missed one word on a delayed recall task and reversed 2 numbers. Emily's voice entered my head immediately. "See, this is what scares me." Dr. Ortiz must have noticed my expression because she said, "Nobody your age scores like a machine. The question is whether you understand choices and consequences." I did. Still, walking back to my truck, I felt less certain than when I arrived. The lock change took place on a Wednesday morning while Emily was at work. I gave Denise a new spare and asked her not to mention it. That afternoon, Emily tried her key. I heard the deadbolt rattle, followed by 3 hard knocks. When I opened the door, she stood on the porch holding grocery bags and wearing the expression of someone whose authority had been challenged. "Why doesn't my key work?" she asked. I told her I was updating security. "Security from whom?" Mark appeared behind her, carrying bottled water. I stepped aside but did not invite them in. Emily stared at me, then at the new lock. "Did someone tell you to do this?" I said I had made the decision myself. Mark lowered his voice. "Walter, sudden changes like this are exactly what worry us." I nearly laughed. They had prepared papers to remove me from my home. Yet a new lock was suspicious. I told them I was tired and would call later. Emily left the groceries on the porch as if I had refused food from a rescue worker. By Friday, the $4,800 had returned to my checking account. The deposit came from Carter Home Renewal, not Emily personally. and the memo read billing correction. There was no apology. Instead, Emily called and said, "Now that the mistake is fixed, can we stop turning this into a crisis?" I asked whether she had created a 12-page record of my supposed cognitive decline. Silence followed. Then she said, "I've been keeping notes because doctors need specifics." I asked about the claim that I wandered outside at 2 in the morning. She answered too quickly. "Maybe I wrote the time wrong. I mentioned the stove and the lost keys. You don't remember everything." "Dad, that's the point." Her tone was softer now, almost compassionate, which made the accusation more difficult to fight. When I told her I had seen the guardianship paperwork, she began to cry. "I was preparing for the worst. You found drafts, not filed documents." I asked who forged my signature. She said nothing for several seconds, then whispered, "I don't know what you're talking about," and hung up. The confrontation came 2 hours later. Emily and Mark arrived without calling, and this time I let them inside because Samuel had advised me to observe more than argue. Emily sat at the kitchen table where Margaret used to sort coupons. Mark remained standing, one hand on the back of a chair. "You invaded private planning documents," Emily said. I reminded her they had been hidden in my bedroom. She insisted she had placed them there temporarily because Mark's office was being reorganized. It was a poor explanation, but she delivered it with confidence. Mark said the power of attorney had been prepared as a sample and that no one intended to use it without my consent. I slid a photocopy across the table and pointed to the signature. "Samples don't need forged signatures." Mark examined it and frowned as if seeing it for the first time. Emily said perhaps the legal service had inserted a scanned signature automatically. Neither of them could explain where that scanned signature came from. Their stories did not collapse dramatically. They simply failed to connect. Emily shifted from denial to accusation. She reminded me of the missed dental appointment, the truck keys, the fall, and the time I had driven to the old pharmacy after my prescription moved to a new location. "You scared me," she said. "You live in a house with stairs, power tools, and a basement. What am I supposed to do? Wait until you're lying there for 2 days?" I told her. Fear did not give her the right to create false incidents. Mark interrupted. "False, according to you." His voice remained calm, but he had begun recording on his phone. I saw the screen reflected in the microwave door. Anger rose in me so quickly that my hands trembled. I wanted to knock the phone away. Instead, I looked directly at him and said, "Record this clearly. You are not authorized to enter my accounts, sell my house, place me in a facility, or sign my name." Mark smiled faintly. "Nobody said we were." Emily covered her face and whispered, "You're treating us like criminals." After they left, Emily began calling relatives. My sister-in-law Ruth phoned the next morning and asked whether I was feeling confused lately. A cousin I had not spoken to in months sent a message saying I should listen to my daughter before pride got me hurt. Denise told me Emily had asked whether she had noticed me wandering or leaving doors open. Even Pastor Collins called to suggest a family meeting. Emily never said I was incompetent outright. She said she was exhausted, frightened, and trying to keep me safe while I resisted everyone who loved me. The story was effective because parts of it were true. I had fallen. I had missed an appointment. I had become angry. I had changed locks and removed her bank access. From the outside, those facts could look like a daughter responding to a difficult father. I began to understand that the guardianship petition was only one part of her strategy. She was building a community of witnesses who would remember her concern and my resistance. Samuel told me to document every contact without retaliating. I created a notebook with dates, teams, and exact language. The habit steadied me. Engineers survive disputes by keeping records, not by raising their voices. I downloaded bank statements, utility bills, pharmacy records, and vehicle maintenance receipts. The pharmacy showed every prescription had been collected on schedule. My auto insurer confirmed no accidents or traffic violations in 11 years. Meadow Glen sent Samuel the intake packet after he requested it in writing. Emily had listed herself as my acting financial agent and estimated my available assets at more than $1 million. She had also selected a private suite rather than a standard apartment and authorized automatic payment from my trust after admission. The document was unsigned by me, but her handwriting filled every line. Under reason for placement, she had written, progressive memory loss, unsafe judgment, resistance to care. Samuel circled the phrase progressive memory loss and asked, who diagnosed that? No one had. Yet it appeared often enough to begin sounding official. The smart home records were harder to retrieve. The stove application had been created under Emily's email address, not mine. So customer service initially refused to release the activity log. Samuel sent a preservation letter, and a technician later confirmed that the system recorded remote commands by device. The burner incident occurred on a Thursday at 1:14 p.m. While I was at breakfast with my retired colleagues. A remote activation had come from a phone registered to Emily. The burner shut off 7 minutes later. Also remotely. There had been no pan on it and no fire. Only a notification that Emily later described in her log as evidence I had left the stove running. I sat in Samuel's office reading the technician's preliminary response and felt something colder than anger. Emily had not merely exaggerated an accident. She had created one. Samuel cautioned that we still needed authenticated records. But the implication was clear. This changes the case, he said. It also means you must assume she may have staged more than one incident. The truck keys became the next question. My doorbell camera stored only 30 days of footage unless clips were manually saved. But Denise's camera faced part of my driveway. She allowed Samuel to review older recordings. On the afternoon, the keys disappeared. Emily had arrived while I was at the hardware store with Mark. She entered using her old key and left 17 minutes later. When Mark and I returned, the truck keys I had used that morning were gone from the hook by the mudroom. Emily found them in the kitchen junk drawer the next day. The video did not show her moving the keys, but it proved she had been alone in the house before they vanished. I remembered how she had held them in her palm and said, "See, this is what scares me." At the time, I had apologized for worrying her. That memory hurt more than the forged signature. A copied name was fraud on paper. The keys were intimate. She had used my trust, my kitchen, and my own embarrassment to make me doubt myself. I made my worst mistake the following Monday. Instead of calling Samuel, I drove to Carter Home Renewal. I told myself I only wanted to ask Mark one question about the bridge loan. His office sat in an industrial strip beside a flooring warehouse, and through the glass wall I saw employees packing samples into boxes. Mark met me near reception and tried to guide me into a private room. I refused. "What bridge loan were you planning to cover with my house?" I asked. 3 employees stopped working. Mark said, "This isn't the place." I raised my voice. "You wrote it on a note attached to papers, meant to have me declared incompetent." He held up both hands and said, "Walter, you're agitated. Let me call Emily." That word agitated pushed me further. I accused him of stealing from me and forging my signature. He denied both. While one employee watched with alarm. Only after I left did I realize Mark had set his phone on the reception counter with the camera facing me. Samuel was furious in the quiet way that made his disappointment worse. "You gave him exactly what he needed," he said after listening to the recording Mark sent Emily. The clip began after my first question, omitting Mark's refusal to explain the bridge loan. It captured me raising my voice, accusing him of crimes, and saying, "I'll make sure you lose everything." I had meant his access to my money, but isolated from context. It sounded threatening. Samuel explained that Mark could submit the recording as evidence of paranoia or impaired judgment. I argued that anger was not incompetence. "Of course it isn't," Samuel replied, "but judges evaluate patterns. And your daughter is manufacturing one." I went home ashamed, not because my accusation was wrong, but because I had allowed Mark to control how it looked. That night I barely slept. At 3 in the morning, I found myself standing in the kitchen, unable to remember why I had gone there. For one terrible second, I wondered whether Emily was right about me after all. The answer arrived by certified mail 2 days later. Emily had filed a petition for emergency guardianship in Franklin County Probate Court. The document accused me of worsening memory loss, unsafe financial decisions, hostility toward caregivers, and attempts to move assets after being confronted about my condition. It included Mark's edited recording, letters from Ruth and my cousin, the Meadow Glen intake packet, and Emily's incident log. She requested temporary authority over my medical placement and finances until a full hearing could occur. The court did not grant her everything, but it appointed an investigator, scheduled a preliminary review, and ordered that I make no extraordinary transfers or changes to major assets without notice. I read the order twice at my dining table. My house still belonged to me, yet a judge who had never met me had already placed a fence around what I could do with it. Samuel said the order was temporary and common in contested cases. It did not feel common from inside my own home. The court investigator, Patricia Bell, visited the following Monday. She inspected the refrigerator, medication organizer, stairs, smoke detectors, and bathroom. She asked me the date, the president's name, my address, and how I paid utilities. I answered correctly, then became irritated when she asked whether Emily had always been my daughter. Patricia noticed, "Mr. Hayes, these questions are not meant to insult you." I apologized and explained the forged documents. She listened without showing whether she believed me. Emily arrived halfway through the visit, claiming she had misunderstood the scheduled time. Patricia allowed her to stay for part of the interview. Emily became the daughter everyone expected, patient, sad, attentive. When I described the remotely activated stove, she said, "Dad, you asked me to monitor it." I said monitoring was not the same as turning it on. She looked at Patricia and whispered, "This is what I mean. He creates explanations after the fact." The sentence landed cleanly because she delivered it without anger. After the investigator left, Emily remained in the living room. "You could stop this," she said. "Agree to a temporary stay at Meadow Glen. Let me manage the bills, and we can tell the court the conflict is resolved." I asked whether resolving the conflict included selling my house. She answered, "Eventually, yes. This place is too much for you." I asked about Mark's bridge loan. Her jaw tightened. "His business has nothing to do with your health." I told her I had seen the note. She stared at the carpet before saying, "Mark is under pressure. That does not mean we plan to steal from you." It was the first admission that the note was real. I asked whether she had guaranteed his debt. She stood too quickly and knocked her purse from the chair. Papers spilled onto the floor. Among them was a collection notice addressed to Mark's company and a personal guarantee bearing Emily's name. She gathered them before I could read more. But her face told me enough. Fear, not only greed, was driving her. Samuel later found public court filings showing Carter Home Renewal owed suppliers, subcontractors, and a private lender nearly $380. Ling ling ling. A lawsuit alleged Mark had used deposits from new clients to finish older projects. No criminal charges existed, but the company was close to collapse. Emily had pledged their own home as collateral on part of the debt. If Mark failed, she could lose her house. I sat with that information longer than Samuel expected. Part of me wanted to believe desperation had carried my daughter farther than she intended. Another part remembered the stove, the keys, and the forged signature. Fear could explain betrayal without excusing it. "She thinks my house is a lifeboat," I said. Samuel nodded. "And she appears willing to push you overboard to climb into it." He then opened a newly obtained document and slid it across the table. The heading read, "Family Care Management Agreement." The agreement proposed that Carter Home Renewal receive $9,000 each month to coordinate property maintenance, transportation, financial administration, and residential transition services after Emily became my guardian or successor trustee. It also allowed Mark's company to charge additional renovation and sale preparation expenses without competitive bids. The contract was dated 3 weeks before my fall in the garage. That detail silenced both of us. Emily had always used the fall as the moment her concern began. Yet the agreement proved they had discussed taking control before I was injured. Attached was an email from Mark to Emily. Once authority is in place, monthly management plus house prep should carry us until closing. Emily replied, Dad will fight if he knows the full plan. We need the medical side documented first. I read the words several times, hoping tone or context might soften them. Nothing did. My accident had not created their plan. It had given them a story. I left Samuel's office with copies sealed in a folder beneath my coat. Outside, traffic moved along Broad Street under a gray sky. Ordinary and indifferent. I had spent days trying to prove that individual incidents were false. But the larger truth was now worse than any single lie. Emily and Mark had prepared a financial system in which my supposed decline became their income. My house became their collateral, and my resistance became evidence against me. Samuel said we would challenge the guardianship, authenticate the electronic records, and complete my medical evaluation. He also warned that the temporary order limited how quickly we could change the trust. From this point forward, he said, assume every conversation is evidence. I drove home without turning on the radio. On my porch sat a new Meadow Glen brochure and a handwritten note from Emily. Please don't make us force this. I carried it inside, placed it beside the forged power of attorney, and finally understood that my daughter did not see herself as someone taking my freedom. She saw herself as someone entitled to decide when I no longer deserved it. The neuropsychological evaluation lasted nearly 4 hours. Dr. Ortiz's colleague, Dr. Nathan Pierce, asked me to repeat lists of words, copy geometric shapes, explain proverbs, organize imaginary appointments, and describe what I would do if a contractor demanded payment for unfinished work. Some tasks felt childish until they became difficult. I remembered 9 of 10 words immediately, but only 7 after a delay. I completed the planning exercises without error, though my hands shook when he asked about Margaret. 3 days later, Dr. Pierce called Samuel and me into his office. His report found no evidence of dementia or impaired decision-making. My memory, reasoning, and financial judgment were consistent with a healthy 72-year-old under significant stress. You are capable of understanding choices and consequences, he said. Relief came slowly because one sentence followed it. Chronic insomnia and grief could cause occasional lapses in attention. Emily's lawyer would use that qualification. Samuel still smiled for the first time in weeks. They wanted a diagnosis, he said. What they have is a tired widower. The medical report gave us room to fight, but not permission to relax. Samuel's investigator, a former bank examiner named Lorraine Price, began tracing Mark's business troubles through public filings, liens, and civil complaints. Carter Home Renewal owed suppliers more than $140. Ling ling ling. Subcontractors nearly $90. Ling ling ling. And a private lender another $150. Ling ling ling. The lender had demanded full payment within 60 days after Mark missed 2 installments. Emily had signed a personal guarantee secured partly by the house she shared with Mark and Lily. If the company collapsed, the lender could pursue them directly. Lorraine also found that Mark had recently applied for another loan and listed anticipated family real estate proceeds as a source of repayment. He did not name my house, but no other family property fit the amount. Samuel placed the application beside the note about my equity, covering the bridge loan. This is motive, he said. It does not prove every act, but it explains why the schedule matters. For Emily and Mark, my supposed decline had a 60-day deadline. I expected anger when I learned the amount of their debt. Instead, I felt a shameful pulse of sympathy. Emily had spent her adult life terrified of instability. When she was 12, Margaret and I nearly lost our first home after my employer delayed payroll during a municipal investigation. We recovered, but Emily remembered the disconnected telephone and the arguments behind the bedroom door. She once told Margaret she would never let her own family live that way. Mark's business failure had placed her inside the exact fear she had built her life to avoid. I could imagine him promising that one temporary loan would save the company, and Emily convincing herself that my house was not really being taken because she would eventually inherit part of it anyway. That reasoning was cruel, but it was not mysterious. She was protecting her home by sacrificing mine. The realization did not soften the stove incident or the forged signature. It only made the betrayal more human, which somehow made it harder to dismiss. The full twist emerged from a section of the trust I had barely remembered. Margaret had established a separate education and opportunity fund for Lily, funded with life insurance proceeds and conservative investments. Its balance had grown to approximately $310. Ling ling ling. The money could pay for college, graduate school, medical needs, or a first home down payment after Lily turned 25. While I remained competent, I served as trustee. If I became incapacitated, Emily would become successor trustee and gain discretion over distributions made for Lily's benefit. The document prohibited direct payment of Emily's personal debts, but a determined trustee could disguise withdrawals as housing, education, or family support expenses. Samuel showed me drafts from 9 years earlier in which Margaret had insisted on restrictions. One handwritten note in the margin read, "Emily acts from panic when money is tight. Protect Lily from adult emergencies." Margaret had seen something I refused to see. She had not distrusted our daughter completely, but she had anticipated the exact weakness now threatening all of us. That sentence reopened an old wound. During Margaret's final weeks, Emily accused her of caring more about Lily's future than about helping Mark expand his company. I had dismissed the argument as grief. Emily had asked for a $100,000 advance from the trust, saying Mark could use it to purchase equipment and hire crews. Margaret refused. "That money is not a family emergency fund," she said from her hospital bed. Emily left the room crying, and I followed her into the hallway. Instead of defending Margaret's decision, I promised Emily we would revisit the issue later. I never did. After Margaret died, Emily mentioned the request twice, and each time I changed the subject. Now Samuel showed me an email Lorraine had recovered from documents attached to Mark's loan application. Emily had written, "Once Dad is no longer trustee, Lily's fund becomes flexible." Mom wrote restrictions, "But they aren't impossible." Mark replied, "Then timing is everything." The plan was larger than my house. They intended to reach money Margaret had deliberately placed beyond them. The appraisal provided the first clear proof that their concern had not begun with my fall. Mark's note called for an updated valuation. So, Lorraine contacted the appraiser listed in the hidden papers. He produced his original engagement email, dated 3 weeks before the garage accident. Mark had requested a confidential pre-sale estimate and told the appraiser that the elderly owner would likely transition to assisted living. Emily had arranged access while I attended a church committee meeting. I remembered returning home that afternoon and noticing a bathroom window unlocked. But I had blamed myself. The appraiser's photographs showed every room, including my study and Margaret's jewelry cabinet. Emily later described my fall as the event that forced her to confront reality. Yet before I ever touched the drop cloth, she had already shown a stranger through my home and discussed how quickly it could be sold. Samuel asked whether I was ready to confront her with the date. I said no. For the first time, I wanted her to keep believing I knew less than I did. Lorraine authenticated another email chain between Mark and a real estate agent named Allison Crane. Mark asked how much cash a quick sale might produce after commissions and repairs. Allison estimated between $610, 0, 0, 0, and $640. Ling ling ling. Depending on timing, Mark answered. Need at least 575 net. Owner may resist. But daughter expects authority soon. Emily was copied on the exchange. 2 days later, she replied, "Do not contact Dad directly. We are still documenting medical concerns. That phrase tied the financial plan to the guardianship strategy more tightly than any emotional argument could untie. When Samuel read the message aloud, I pictured Emily standing in my kitchen arranging my medication bottles by color, asking whether I had slept well, and writing down every hesitation. I had interpreted those visits as an overdue closeness between father and daughter. She had been conducting an inventory, not only of the house and accounts, but of me, my weaknesses, habits, and moments of grief. I had given her access because I wanted forgiveness. She had mistaken access for permission. Samuel did not allow me to blame Emily for everything. "How much authority did you give her without review?" he asked. I admitted I had added her to bill payment, shared trust information, allowed her to install connected devices, and ignored Margaret's warnings about financial boundaries. After years of being absent, I had overcorrected. I said yes whenever Emily asked for help because refusal felt like repeating the past. When Mark's company struggled 3 years earlier, I loaned them $65,000 without a written repayment schedule. Only $12,000 had been returned. When Lily needed a car, I paid for it without discussing limits. When Emily asked for access to my bills, I accepted her promise instead of defining her authority. I had spent decades treating money as proof of love, then acted surprised when my family began measuring love in dollars. That did not make me responsible for fraud, but it explained why Emily believed my boundaries were temporary obstacles rather than decisions. My counterattack would fail if I merely removed her. I needed to correct the system that made her power possible. The temporary court order prohibited extraordinary transfers, but it did not automatically prevent me from amending a revocable trust if I remained competent and followed proper procedure. Samuel moved carefully. He notified the court investigator, attached Dr. Pierce's evaluation, and arranged for 2 independent witnesses, a separate attorney, and a videotaped capacity interview. I answered questions about the trust's purpose, assets, beneficiaries, and consequences. Then I replaced Emily as successor trustee with the trust department of a regional bank. Lily's fund received additional restrictions: no distributions to satisfy either parent's debts, no loans to family businesses, and no control by Emily or Mark under any circumstance. I also named Samuel's firm as trust protector, authorized to challenge improper withdrawals. The amendment did not disinherit Emily. It removed her ability to control assets while I was alive or incapacitated. Samuel asked whether I wanted to cut her out entirely. "No," I said. "I want to stop the theft, not pretend she was never my daughter." We did not announce the amendment. The court would eventually receive it. But Samuel wanted to observe how Emily and Mark behaved while believing guardianship still promised control. I called Emily and told her the legal fight was exhausting me. I said Meadow Glen might not be as bad as I had first thought and asked whether the private suite remained available. Her voice changed instantly. For weeks, she had spoken to me with guarded patience, as if every sentence might become evidence. Now warmth returned. "Dad, I'm so relieved," she said. "You'll have people around you. Meals, activities, everything." I asked whether selling the house would be necessary. She said we could discuss it after I settled in, but then mentioned that spring was the best time to list. Mark joined the call and told me I was making the mature choice. I nearly responded that maturity was not surrender. But I held my tongue. They believed pressure had worked. That belief made them careless. 2 days later, Emily brought dinner from a restaurant Margaret used to love. She set the table, poured iced tea, and spoke about Meadow Glen's woodworking room as though she had personally designed it for me. Mark arrived with a folder labeled Transition Plan. Inside were a moving schedule, a proposed estate sale contract, and an agreement authorizing Carter home renewal to prepare the house for listing. The monthly management fee had been reduced from $9,000 to set to $1. Woobat. Perhaps because they feared the original amount looked excessive, I asked simple questions and pretended to struggle with the pages. Mark pointed to signature lines and said we could complete them later. Emily touched my wrist. You don't have to handle every detail anymore. I looked at her hand and remembered teaching her to ride a bicycle in the same driveway Mark planned to repave at my expense. Maybe you're right, I said. The relief on her face was so immediate that any remaining doubt about her priorities disappeared. I asked what would happen to Lily's fund if I moved. Emily's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Mark answered first. Nothing. It stays invested. I said Meadow Glen could become expensive, and perhaps the fund should help the family if necessary. Emily glanced at Mark before saying, Mom wanted it used for Lily. But supporting Lily's household supports her too. I asked whether paying their mortgage counted as supporting Lily. Emily replied that losing the family home would damage Lily's future more than any tuition bill. Her logic was prepared, not spontaneous. Mark added, Money should solve the emergency in front of you. It was almost the same principle I had lived by for years. Hearing it used against Margaret's wishes felt like listening to an echo accuse me. Samuel, who attended the dinner under the pretense of helping make the transition legally smooth, wrote the exchange into his notes. Emily knew he was present, yet confidence had made her reveal the argument she intended to use as trustee. Mark eventually sensed the trap. A week later, he discovered through a court filing that Samuel had submitted Dr. Pierce's evaluation and referenced recent estate planning measures. He called Emily from his office, and she arrived at my house furious. What did you change? She demanded, before removing her coat. I told her my legal affairs were private. She accused Samuel of manipulating me and threatened to report him for exploiting a vulnerable adult. Mark's attorney immediately filed an emergency motion asking the court to freeze all trust changes and invalidate any amendment executed after the guardianship petition was prepared. The motion claimed Samuel had isolated me from family and directed me to revoke Emily's access. It was false, but effective enough that the judge ordered no further changes until the full hearing. The amendment already signed remained disputed. For the first time, Samuel admitted the court might decide I lacked capacity at the moment of signing, despite the medical report. If that happened, Emily could regain control. The investigator returned for a second interview, this time accompanied by a court-appointed physician. I answered questions about the amendment, Mark's debt, and the reasons I distrusted Emily. Then the physician asked Margaret's date of death. I knew the month, the year, the hospital room, the exact weather outside, and the dress Emily wore at the funeral, but the numerical date vanished. I searched for it while both women watched. The harder I tried, the farther it moved. Finally, I said, October 17th. Then realized from the investigator's expression that I was wrong. Margaret died on October 19th. Emily, seated across the room, lowered her eyes as if witnessing a private tragedy. He visits the cemetery every month, she said softly. He always knew the date. Shame tightened my throat. I explained that grief did not follow calendars, but the moment had already become part of the record. After they left, I stood beside Margaret's photograph and wondered whether defending my competence had made every ordinary failure feel like a confession. That night I considered giving up the house, not surrendering control to Emily, but accepting that the stairs, the yard, and the empty rooms had become more burden than shelter. I realized I had fused independence with remaining unchanged. Margaret would not have wanted me preserving our home like a sealed museum. The next morning, I told Samuel that even if we won, I planned to sell on my own terms and move to a smaller apartment near the park. He nodded. That may help the court understand what you are defending, I said. I'm not fighting to prove I need no help. I'm fighting for the right to choose what help I accept. The distinction restored something in me. Emily's plan depended on portraying every concession as evidence of incapacity and every refusal as evidence of paranoia. I could acknowledge age without granting her ownership of it. We prepared for the hearing with that position. I was willing to change my life, but not willing to have it changed through fraud. The following afternoon, Emily arrived with a Meadow Glen representative named Karen and a rolling suitcase. She had not warned me. Karen smiled professionally and said they wanted to make the transition as gentle as possible. Emily carried the suitcase upstairs and placed it open on my bed. "Just pack enough for 2 weeks," she said. "After the hearing, we can move the rest." I reminded her that no judge had ordered me into a facility. She answered, "The court will see that you're resisting because you're frightened. It will be easier if you cooperate now." Mark waited downstairs beside a stack of empty storage boxes. I looked at the suitcase, then at Margaret's dresser, and understood how certain they were that the house already belonged to the future they had designed. I closed the suitcase without placing anything inside. "Leave it," I told Emily. "I may need it soon." She mistook my words for surrender. In truth, I had decided exactly what I would carry into court, and it was not clothing. I left Emily's suitcase open on the bed until after she and Mark drove away. Then I called Samuel and asked whether a voluntary 2-night stay at Meadow Glen would hurt my case. He was silent for a moment before saying it could help if the terms were precise. "You are not being admitted because you lack capacity," he said. "You are evaluating housing options as a competent adult." By noon, he had drafted a letter stating that I retained control over my home, finance, medical care, and belongings. Emily could arrange transportation and meals, but she had no authority to sell, discard, move, photograph, or contract for work at the house. I signed the letter in front of Meadow Glen's administrator and gave copies to Emily, Mark, and the court investigator. Emily barely read hers. She hugged me and whispered, "You're finally doing the sensible thing." I let her believe the suitcase meant surrender. In reality, it gave me 48 hours to see what they would do when they thought I was out of the way. Meadow Glen was not the prison I had imagined. My room overlooked a frozen pond. The food was decent, and a retired history teacher beat me twice at chess. The residents were people who had chosen smaller lives after larger ones became exhausting. That mattered. Emily was not wrong because the place was unpleasant. She was wrong because she tried to force the decision and profit from it. During the second afternoon, Karen asked why Emily had marked memory supervision required when I had arrived independently and managed my medication. I showed her Dr. Pierce's report. Karen later told Samuel that Emily had called twice asking staff to document confusion, wandering, or resistance. None had occurred. Even there, Emily was searching for evidence that fit her story. At home, the cameras did the observing for me. After the stove incident, Samuel had advised me to install 2 visible interior cameras in the entry hall and study, areas where no one had a reasonable expectation of privacy. Denise kept an eye on the driveway. Less than 3 hours after Emily dropped me at Meadow Glen, Mark arrived with 2 employees, a photographer, and Allison Crane, the real estate agent. Emily unlocked the house with a key she should no longer have possessed. Apparently she had copied it before I changed the locks. They moved through each room, placing adhesive dots on furniture, measuring walls, and discussing which items would show poorly. Mark opened Margaret's jewelry cabinet and photographed the shelves. One employee asked whether they had the owner's approval. Mark answered, "We'll have authority after Friday. This is just prep." The camera caught every word. Emily stood beside Margaret's dresser and said, "Anything personal can go into storage. We need the house empty fast." She never looked at the framed wedding photograph beside her elbow. I returned 6 hours earlier than they expected. Samuel drove me because he wanted a witness and because my truck remained at Meadow Glen. When we opened the front door, paper tags hung from chairs, lamps, paintings, and boxes of Margaret's letters. A red sticker marked the walnut dining table we had bought after our 20th anniversary. Mark was in the basement estimating repair costs. Emily came down the stairs carrying a box labeled "Donate" and stopped when she saw me. "Dad, why are you here?" she asked, as if I had entered her home without permission. I held up Samuel's letter and asked why strangers were sorting my belongings. Mark said they were only preparing options and accused Samuel of creating conflict. Every part of me wanted to tear the stickers away and throw them out. Instead, I asked Mark to send me the complete transition proposal, including fees, vendors, sales schedule, and authority he believed he would receive. He mistook my restraint for defeat. "I'll have it to you tonight," he said. That was exactly what Samuel wanted. The proposal arrived at 9:17 p.m. It called for Carter home renewal to receive $7,500 per month, plus a 15% project management fee on repairs, a 4% coordination fee on the home sale, storage charges, transportation charge, and reimbursement for family administrative labor. The timeline assumed that temporary guardianship would be granted Friday, the house listed within 30 days, and most personal property sold or donated before I completed any permanent move. Mark attached an estimated equity schedule showing $592,000 available after costs. A column labeled DEBT, stabilization, allocated $320,000 to an unidentified family obligation. Another $95,000 was marked reserve for residential care. Nothing explained where the remaining money would go. Samuel replied with one sentence, "Please confirm whether this is the plan you intend to submit if Mrs. Bly Carter is appointed guardian." Mark answered, "Yes, subject to court approval." He had now placed his financial motive into writing after the petition was filed. Lily came to my house the following evening without her parents. She was 17, tall like Margaret, with the same habit of rubbing her thumb against the edge of a sleeve when frightened. "Grandpa, do you have dementia?" she asked before taking off her coat. I told her no, then showed her the first page of Dr. Pierce's report. She read it twice and began crying. Emily had told her I sometimes failed to recognize family and might hurt myself if left alone. Lily then admitted that months earlier, her mother had asked her to photograph me asleep in the living room because the doctor needs to see how exhausted he gets. Another time, Emily told her to move my truck keys into the kitchen drawer so I would not drive after taking pain medication. Lily believed it was a safety precaution. Emily later described the hidden keys as something I had done myself. Lily kept saying, "I didn't know." I told her ignorance was not betrayal and that she would not be used as a weapon against either parent. Samuel arranged for Lily to speak with the court investigator in the presence of an independent youth advocate. We did not coach her. She described exactly what Emily had asked her to do, including the photograph and the keys, and admitted she could not know whether her mother intended from the beginning to use those events in court. Her statement corroborated the pattern without carrying the entire case. When Emily learned Lily had spoken, she called me in tears. "You dragged my child into this," she said. I reminded her that Lily was also the beneficiary of the fund she planned to control. Emily insisted she had never intended to take Lily's money, only to borrow against it temporarily if Mark's company failed. "We would have paid it back," she said. I asked with what income, since the company was already using new deposits to finish old jobs. Her crying stopped. "You've been investigating us," I answered. "You investigated me first." Mark's response was immediate and disciplined. His attorney submitted an edited video from Thanksgiving, showing me waking from a nap and joking. "I don't even know what day it is." The clip ended before everyone laughed, and Lily reminded me that football had started. He also produced the recording from his office, my incorrect answer about Margaret's death date, and a statement from Ruth saying I had become suspicious and secretive. Then Mark alleged that the cameras in my own home proved paranoia and claimed I had staged their visit by inviting them to prepare the property. Samuel countered with the signed letter forbidding entry and disposal, plus footage of Mark saying he expected authority after Friday. Still, the attack worked well enough to complicate the investigator's report. She concluded that I appeared capable, but that the family conflict had become so severe that limited financial oversight might be appropriate until the court resolved the trust dispute. Competence was no longer the only issue. The judge also had to decide whom to believe. Emily called Samuel and requested a private settlement meeting. We met at a diner near the courthouse, where she arrived alone and looked 10 years older than she had a month earlier. She admitted Mark had pushed the guardianship after his lender threatened foreclosure. But she refused to place the plan entirely on him. "I agreed because I thought you would never help us, voluntarily," she said. I reminded her that I had already loaned them $65. "Ling ling ling. That wasn't enough," she replied, then looked ashamed of the words. Her proposal was simple. I would accept a limited guardianship, withdraw accusations concerning the signature and stove, allow the house to be prepared for sale, and authorize a loan to stabilize Mark's company. In exchange, she would abandon permanent placement and let me choose an apartment. She presented it as compromise. I saw the same plan with softer language. "You made my home the price of saving yours," I told her. "Then you made my resistance sound like illness." Emily stared through the window and said, "If you win, Lily may lose her house." I offered Lily support but refused every financial condition. The settlement meeting changed something between Emily and Mark. Lily told the investigator she heard them arguing late that night. Mark accused Emily of becoming weak. Emily accused him of turning her concern into a financial plan. The next morning, Mark sent Walter's proposed care plan directly to the court. Perhaps to prevent Emily from withdrawing it, the filing requested authority to sell the house within 30 days and appoint Carter Home Renewal as property manager. Emily's signature appeared beneath his. Whether she signed willingly or under pressure, she did not revoke it. Samuel used the filing to request financial disclosures. Bank records showed that 2 weeks before my garage fall, Mark had paid a legal document service to draft a guardianship petition and power of attorney. The payment came from a joint account. We still could not prove which of them copied my signature. But the timing destroyed their claim that the fall created an emergency. Their legal planning had begun before the accident. They called the turning point. Mark then found a way to hurt me where I felt safest. He persuaded the court to expand the temporary financial restriction until the hearing, arguing that my trust amendment and proposed apartment move were attempts to hide assets. The bank froze all non-routine transactions, including the deposit I had planned to place on a 2-bedroom apartment overlooking Franklin Park. At the leasing office, my payment was declined while a young manager waited politely across the desk. I had to explain that my daughter was seeking guardianship and that the court had restricted my accounts. The apartment was released to another applicant the next day. I drove home furious with Samuel, the judge, Emily, and myself. For the first time, their plan caused a loss that could not be repaired by producing another document. I had found a future I wanted, and they had taken it before I could reach it. That evening, I almost called Emily and accepted her settlement. Instead, I walked through every room of the house and asked what I was truly afraid of losing. The answer was not the building. It was the authority to decide when and how I left it. Samuel helped me submit a narrower housing plan funded from ordinary monthly income, which remained available under the order. A smaller apartment in the same neighborhood agreed to hold a unit until after the hearing, without a large deposit. I also hired a licensed care manager, paid at market rate and with no connection to my family, to evaluate what support I might reasonably need. Her report recommended weekly housekeeping, medication reminders by phone, and avoiding ladders. It did not recommend guardianship or memory care. By accepting practical help voluntarily, I removed one of Emily's strongest arguments, that I refused assistance because I lacked insight. I was not proving I could live without anyone. I was proving I could assess risk and choose assistance without surrendering legal control. Discovery closed 3 days before the hearing. Samuel organized the evidence into a sequence rather than a pile. The pre-accident care contract, the early appraisal, Mark's loan application, the remote stove activation, Denise's camera footage, the copied signature, Meadow Glen's intake form, the monthly management agreement, and the court filing requesting a rapid sale. None of it alone explained the entire betrayal. Together, the documents showed planning, motive, fabrication, and expected profit. Mark's attorney planned to argue that desperate families often prepare for decline before an obvious crisis, and that financial benefit did not erase genuine concern. Samuel warned me that the judge could still impose limited guardianship if she believed conflict made independent management unsafe. "There is no guaranteed victory," he said. I appreciated the honesty. The case was not about proving Emily had never loved me. It was about proving that whatever love remained had become entangled with fear, entitlement, and money until she no longer respected my consent. The night before court, I packed the suitcase Emily had left on my bed. I placed no clothing inside. Instead, I packed the original forged power of attorney, the trust, Dr. Pierce's report, the stove records, photographs of the tagged furniture, Margaret's handwritten note protecting Lily, and the transition proposal showing the debt allocation. While comparing the forged signature with an old engineering contract, I noticed again that the ink blur beneath the final S appeared in precisely the same shape on both pages. A copied signature did not reproduce only handwriting, it reproduced flaws from the source. Samuel had already retained a document examiner, and her report confirmed the image had been digitally transferred. The evidence was not new, but the suitcase made its meaning physical. Emily had brought it to remove me from my home. I would carry it into court to show why she had no right to do so. The courthouse hallway smelled of floor polish and burnt coffee. Mark stood beside his attorney in a navy suit, speaking quietly and confidently. Emily sat alone on a wooden bench, twisting her wedding ring. Lily waited with the youth advocate near the elevator and gave me a small nod. Samuel placed one hand on the suitcase handle, but I kept hold of it. Through the courtroom doors, I could hear papers shifting and chairs scraping. Emily finally looked at me. For a second, she was not the petitioner trying to control my estate or the frightened wife trying to save a failing business. She was the little girl who once waited beside a school stage curtain for a father who arrived too late. I loved her. I no longer trusted her. Both truths entered the courtroom with me. Then the clerk opened the door and called. In the matter of Walter Hayes, I lifted the suitcase Emily had meant for my departure and carried it toward the final decision. The judge entered at 9 sharp, and everyone rose. Judge Miriam Caldwell was a small woman with silver hair and the expression of someone who had spent years watching families translate private resentments into legal language. She explained that the hearing concerned 2 questions: whether I lacked capacity to make personal and financial decisions, and whether emergency guardianship was necessary to prevent immediate harm. Emily's attorney began with the version of events I had already heard. I was a grieving widower whose judgment had declined after a fall. I forgot appointments, misplaced keys, left appliances running, rejected help, changed locks, accused family members of crimes, and attempted to alter my estate after concerns were raised. Each fact sounded reasonable when separated from its cause. Emily sat with her hands folded, looking neither proud nor angry. When her attorney asked why she had filed the petition, she said, "Because I was afraid my father would die alone while I stood by doing nothing." Emily described finding me bruised after the garage fall and imagining what might have happened if Denise had not been nearby. She spoke about Margaret's death, my empty house, and the way I sometimes lost track of conversations when I was tired. Some of what she said was true, and that made listening difficult. She had worried about me. She had brought groceries, installed grab bars, and called doctors. Then Samuel began asking about dates. He showed her the family care management agreement prepared 3 weeks before my fall. Emily admitted she had reviewed it, but claimed Mark had drafted it as a general contingency. Samuel displayed the appraisal request from the same period, including her email arranging access while I attended church. "If the fall caused your concern," he asked, "why were you preparing to sell his house before it happened?" Emily looked toward Mark before answering. "We had concerns before the fall." Samuel nodded. "Concerns serious enough to value the property, but not serious enough to tell your father?" She said she had wanted to avoid frightening me. Samuel moved to the incident log. Emily repeated that I had left the stove on. The authenticated smart home records appeared on the monitor, showing the burner had been activated remotely from her registered phone while I was at breakfast across town. She said she might have tested the safety system and forgotten. Samuel then showed the entry she wrote that same day. Dad left burner operating unattended for an extended period. Denies responsibility. The burner had been on 7 minutes. Emily's attorney objected that the application data did not prove intent. Judge Caldwell agreed, but allowed the record because it contradicted the description of the event. Samuel did not accuse Emily of staging an accident. He simply asked why her log omitted that she controlled the device. Emily said, "I was overwhelmed." It was the answer she returned to whenever documents refused to support her memory. Overwhelmed explained mistakes. It did not explain why every mistake pointed in the same direction toward my incapacity and her authority. The truck keys followed. Denise's camera footage showed Emily entering my house alone before the keys disappeared. Lily's statement explained that Emily had instructed her to move them as a safety precaution, then later recorded the incident as evidence that I had misplaced them. Emily insisted she had only wanted to stop me from driving after pain medication. Samuel asked why she had not simply told me. He would have argued. She said, "So you allowed him to believe he had lost them?" Emily's face tightened. For one day, Samuel read the log entry describing increasing disorientation and inability to remember ordinary storage locations. The courtroom became very still. Judge Caldwell asked Emily directly whether she now agreed that the entry was misleading. Emily whispered, "Yes." That single admission mattered more than a dramatic confession. It established that the record presented to doctors and relatives was not a neutral diary. It was a collection shaped to produce a conclusion. Emily had not merely watched me decline. She had edited my life until ordinary resistance looked like disease. Mark testified next. He denied forging my signature, manipulating Emily, or expecting personal gain from guardianship. He described Carter Home Renewal's proposed fees as ordinary compensation for extensive work. Samuel displayed the transition plan, allocating $320, 000, of my home equity to debt stabilization. Mark said the term referred to maintaining my long-term care reserve. Samuel placed Mark's loan application beside it, highlighting anticipated family real estate proceeds as a repayment source. Then came the email to Allison Crane, estimating the net proceeds from a quick sale, and Mark's statement that the daughter expected authority soon. Mark's attorney argued that families often discuss using shared resources during emergencies. Samuel answered with the management agreement, the 15% renovation fee, the sale coordination fee, and Mark's email saying monthly management and house preparation would carry the business until closing. "Your company would have been paid before Mr. Hayes settled permanently anywhere," Samuel said. Mark replied, "I intended to provide real services. That was possible. It was also the problem. He had designed a business opportunity around removing me from control of my own property." The forged power of attorney was the moment Mark's confidence finally broke. The document examiner explained how the signature image matched one from an old engineering contract, including the identical ink blur beneath the final letter. A naturally written signature could resemble another, but it would not reproduce a stain from the source page. She found digital compression around the image and no pen pressure on the paper. Samuel established that Mark's joint account had paid the legal document company that prepared the form before my fall. The company's records showed the completed document had been emailed to an address used by Carter Home Renewal. Mark claimed an employee may have inserted the signature without instruction. Emily turned toward him sharply. Samuel did not ask the examiner to identify who performed the copying because she could not. He asked only whether I had signed the document in ink. "No," she said. Judge Caldwell looked at Mark and Emily. Yet this instrument was stored with materials intended to support control over Mr. Hayes's finances. Neither answered. "Dr. Pierce testified that I understood my assets, family relationships, medical choices, and the consequences of changing my trust. He acknowledged that I had grief-related insomnia and ordinary age-associated memory lapses." Emily's attorney emphasized that I had given the wrong date for Margaret's death and become angry at Mark's office. Dr. Pierce remained calm. "Capacity is not perfection," he said. A person may forget a date, make a poor choice, or display anger and still retain the ability to understand decisions. Mr. Hayes demonstrated consistent reasoning across multiple sessions. The independent care manager then described my home, medication routine, driving record, and willingness to accept weekly assistance. Her recommendation was not that I remain alone without limits. She advised housekeeping, remote medication reminders, and no ladder use. Judge Caldwell asked whether I needed memory care. No, the manager replied. He needs a realistic aging plan, which he has participated in creating. That distinction exposed the false choice Emily had built. Either I submitted to her control, or I denied age entirely. When Samuel called me, I carried the suitcase to the witness stand and placed it beside my chair. I explained that Emily had brought it to my bedroom before any court order required me to leave. I admitted missing the dental appointment, confusing Lily's name with Emily's at Thanksgiving, and losing my temper at Mark's office. I also admitted something harder. I had been an absent father too often and had tried to repair emotional failures with money. I gave Emily access without limits because saying no felt like failing her again. I told the judge, that was poor judgment. It was not incapacity. I said I no longer wanted to maintain the large house forever. I planned to sell it, move to a smaller apartment, and hire help. Emily began crying when I said that. The issue is not whether my life should change. I continued. It should. The issue is who decides, and whether my daughter may manufacture evidence because she dislikes my answer. Samuel asked why I had amended the trust. I explained Margaret's fund for Lily, Mark's debt, the emails discussing flexibility, and my decision to appoint an independent bank as successor trustee. I had not removed Emily as a beneficiary. I had removed her control. Emily's attorney argued that Samuel influenced the amendment after isolating me. The independent attorney who supervised the signing testified that Samuel left the room during the capacity interview. The video showed me naming each asset, explaining every change, and describing the foreseeable consequence that Emily might receive less direct access. No last-minute document saved me. The amendment had been discussed in Chapter 3 of my life, so to speak, after medical testing, notice, witnesses, and review. Judge Caldwell watched part of the recording twice. Then she asked me what I would do if the court denied guardianship. Sell the house when I choose. I said, move somewhere smaller, keep support in place, and stop confusing dependence with love. The judge recessed for 53 minutes. During that time, no one spoke directly to me. Mark paced near the drinking fountain, checking his phone. Emily sat with Lily at the far end of the corridor, though Lily kept several inches between them. Samuel warned me that the court could still impose a limited guardian for finances while rejecting residential placement. I understood. The evidence showed deception, but judges often preferred protective compromises in families this damaged. When we returned, Judge Caldwell read her findings slowly. She found that Emily had demonstrated genuine concern after my fall, but that concern had become inseparable from serious financial conflicts. The incident log contained material misrepresentations. The proposed arrangements benefited Mark's company. The medical evidence did not establish incapacity. My anger, grief, and isolated lapses were insufficient grounds to remove fundamental rights. The petition for emergency and permanent guardianship is denied, she said. My hands tightened around the suitcase handle before I allowed myself to breathe. Judge Caldwell upheld the trust amendment provisionally, subject only to routine bank review, because the signing process showed clear capacity and independent advice. She ordered Emily to provide a complete accounting of every transaction made through my former bill-paying access. The $4,800 had already been returned, but she required reimbursement of additional unauthorized fees totaling $1,260 and permitted Samuel to seek part of my legal expenses from the petitioners. She referred the power of attorney and supporting records to the county prosecutor and directed the clerk to send the materials to law enforcement for investigation. She did not declare Emily or Mark guilty of a crime. That decision belonged elsewhere. She also warned Mark that no sale, renovation, or entry into my home could occur without my written authorization. Her final words were directed at Emily. Concern for an aging parent does not create ownership of that parent. Fear does not excuse fabrication. Emily lowered her head. Mark stared straight ahead. Outside the courtroom, Mark blamed Emily before we reached the elevator. You admitted the log was misleading. Hey, he said. Emily turned on him. You copied his signature. Mark said she had supplied the contract. Lily stepped between them and said, Stop making Grandpa the reason you did this. The elevator doors opened, but Mark walked away toward the stairs. Emily remained beside the suitcase, crying silently. She asked whether I was happy now that her family would lose everything. I told her I was not happy. I had protected myself. Those were different things. Your house was never mine to save, I said, and mine was never yours to spend. She asked whether I would help Lily if the lender foreclosed. I said Lily would always have a safe place and her fund would remain protected. But I would not pay Mark's business debt or shield either of them from consequences. Emily nodded once, as though a door had closed. Carter Home Renewal did not survive the spring. The private lender accelerated its loan after learning that the anticipated family proceeds were unavailable, and several suppliers obtained judgments. Mark sold equipment, dismissed his remaining employees, and eventually filed for business bankruptcy. The forged signature investigation continued for months. I was interviewed twice and provided the original document. I never learned every technical detail, but Mark accepted a negotiated civil resolution involving restitution and probation on a document-related charge rather than risk trial. Emily was not charged with forging the signature. Her emails and false incident log remained part of the record. However, and she could no longer present herself as an innocent bystander. She and Mark separated before summer. I did not celebrate that either. Their marriage had contained years I knew little about, and collapse rarely punishes only the person who caused it. Lily moved temporarily into a campus-adjacent apartment funded through the trust under the independent bank's supervision. I listed my house in May, using an agent with no connection to Mark or Emily. It sold for $600 a sexo halfiers. 000 after an ordinary inspection and 6 weeks on the market. I kept Margaret's dresser, our wedding photograph, 2 boxes of letters, and the walnut table with the red sticker removed. Everything else was sold, donated, or given away by my decision. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment overlooking Franklin Park. Not the first unit I had lost, but one with wider windows and a better kitchen. A housekeeper came every Tuesday. My pharmacy sent reminders to my phone. I hired someone to clean the gutters and gave away the extension ladder. None of those choices made me less independent. They made my independence sustainable. The sale proceeds entered the trust managed by the bank, and Lily's $310,000 fund remained separate, protected from family businesses, parental debts, and emergency requests dressed as investments. 3 months after the hearing, Emily mailed me a 6-page letter. She did not begin by blaming Mark. That was why I read past the first page. She admitted she had been frightened of losing her home, ashamed of the guarantee she signed, and furious that Margaret had restricted Lily's money. She wrote that every time I refused, she heard the father who had missed her childhood and assumed I was choosing work or control over her again. Then she admitted the truth that mattered. She had used my past failures to justify present deception. She asked me to forgive her. I could not yet. Forgiveness offered too quickly would have been another form of avoiding boundaries. I replied that I would meet her after she began counseling, separated her finances from Mark, and accepted responsibility without calling the plan protection. 2 months later, she sent proof that she had done the first 2 and was working on the third. We met at a cafe near the park on a rainy Thursday. Emily looked tired and uncertain, without folders, contracts, or a phone placed between us. She apologized for the stove, the keys, the log, the appraisal, and the pressure on Lily. She did not ask for money. I apologized for the years when I made her feel like an appointment I could reschedule, and for teaching her, through my behavior, that financial rescue was the closest thing our family had to love. I told her those failures explained our history but did not transfer responsibility for what she had done. She agreed. We did not hug at the end. We scheduled another coffee for the following month. Repair, I learned, was less dramatic than revenge. It consisted of small meetings where nobody demanded immediate trust. That evening, I returned to my apartment carrying groceries in one hand and my keys in the other. The park outside my windows was bright after the rain, and children rode bicycles along the wet path. Margaret's dresser stood against the bedroom wall, smaller in the new room, but no less familiar. On top of it rested the photograph Emily had nearly packed away, and the metal box that once held the papers hidden behind my drawer. I no longer opened that box often. Winning had not restored the family I thought I had, and it had not erased the father I had failed to be. It gave me something quieter, the right to face those truths without someone using them to own me. I locked the door, set my keys on the hook. I not restored the family I thought I had, and it had not erased the father had chosen, and understood at last that living alone was never the point. The point was that help should enter through a door I opened, not through papers hidden in my bedroom.